All right. So, a little space story time to close things out. Thank you for joining us for this episode. If you're staying this long, you're awesome, and really appreciate it. But let's talk about the N-1 Soviet rockets. The N-1 was designed to compete with the U.S. Saturn V. Now, the Saturn V rocket is not the same. Oh, this is backwards. Thanks to our friends at Estes, we have the Saturn V here. But the Saturn V is not the same thing as Starship, and the N-1 was not the same thing as the Saturn V. So the N-1 was in some places described as potentially a 5-stage rocket. The Saturn V was a 3-stage rocket. The Starship is a 2-stage rocket. But the really interesting thing, and there's a lot of data we can go into. We could talk about the thrust differences, the amount of engines. We'll touch a little bit on it. But I think, to me, the most important thing about the N-1 and the story behind the comparison between the N-1 and Starship and the challenges that Starship is going to face, and the N-1 is really where we should point this. And the story really starts with Sergei Korolev. So Sergei Korolev was basically the main designer, the head designer of a lot of the Soviet era rocketry. So the Soyuz system, right? Those boosters, we see this happen with the Soyuz system where those boosters will detach and they'll spiral out in a very specific pattern. And that's a Korolev maneuver. And what that does is it's optimizing basically the thrust for that rocket to go into space. But it's an example of just how influential Korolev was in rocketry, that Soyuz rocket, and that maneuver is still used today when that thing launches into space. Now, when this was first shown to be launching, the N-1, nobody knew that Korolev was the main designer. His name, I guess, was hidden. Again, this is all based on old articles that we had to go to a place where it still shows that stuff. It's called Wayback Machine. So this is the Wikipedia sources, and we're going through them here. But so Korolev was designing this, and there's one article here that kind of goes more into the story, and I'll read this. Take it with a grain of salt. This was released October 31st, 2016. It's a capture, so this isn't up anymore. But I think this captures it perfectly. So on June 23rd, 1960, the USSR gave the go-ahead to the N-1 project via a decree, basically, that they wanted to compete with the US. It was to use liquid propellant engines. It was oxygen kerosene on all stages, and the launch mass with the payload was 2,200 tons. Now, while this was happening, Yuri Gagarin was basically a year before going into space for the first time, to give you an idea of where we are in history here. And Yuri Gagarin, for those that are unaware, we just had Yuri's Night recently, was the first human being that went into space. And yes, it was a Soviet astronaut. But Yuri Gagarin is kind of seen, especially for those that celebrate Yuri's Night, as a human being. He's not seen as a Soviet as much as he is the first human that goes to space. And it's a beautiful thing that we have that as symbolism, and it's not just the space race and war and one country being better than the other. So Korolev was looking for someone to help design this rocket with him. Valentin Glushko was the person that was the designer for heavy lift rockets. And so they had been friends, and unfortunately, I guess they had a falling out. And so Korolev basically had to go find another person to help design the rocket. And so he found Nikolai Kuznetsov, and he had a lot of experience with jet aircraft engines, but not rocket engines. So the whole reason that the N-1 has all those rings of small engines is because it was easier to build a smaller engine than a bigger engine, according to this. So they also tried to create they called this the Kord system, KORD, which would control those engines moving. So, you have smaller thrust vectors that you're controlling each individually to make sure that this massive thing goes up into space. There were 4 test flights of the N1, and on the second one is where that world record of the largest non-nuclear explosion to ever happen, that's where it happened on the pad. Now, that pad destruction basically delayed any kind of progress for about 2 years, because now the thing that they would launch the rocket from is now destroyed and it needs to be rebuilt. Between the second and third launches, Sergei Korolev dies, and he had been, and this is kind of the storied, I don't want to call it a tradition, but a theme of working yourself to death, not only in engineering, which is of course the field that I chose, but in creative endeavors, in innovation and doing new things. There's kind of this trend of making sure that you don't work yourself to death and keeping yourself healthy while you're trying to do the insanely difficult or challenging thing that you're doing. I mean, it's not just space, but we see this a lot with space because of how hard it is. And as I was doing research about Sergei Korolev, I found out that, again, between the second and third test of the N1, Sergei Korolev passes away. And he passes away after many years of struggling with his health. He suffered a heart attack in 1960, and then he had a kidney disorder after he was detained in Soviet prison camps when he was younger. So his body was already not doing well, but he was also the main designer for the N1 and knew that if he wasn't able to get the N1 to work, then the Soviet Union couldn't keep the propaganda going and couldn't basically fight the US. And so he kept pushing himself. In 1962, his health problems were starting to stack up and was basically suffering from many things. His intestines were bleeding. And in 1964, he was diagnosed with cardiac arrhythmia, so his heart's failing, and then he has inflammation in his gallbladder. His body was essentially breaking down. And while his death itself is as most Soviet deaths, somewhat uncertain, what we know here is that in 1965, he was supposedly diagnosed with a bleeding polyp in his large intestine. And then he entered the hospital on the 5th of January, 1966, and they find a cancerous tumor in his abdomen. But Valentin Glushko, the old, no longer friend, said that he actually died due to a poorly performed operation for hemorrhoids. So, not to keep getting, classically dark here, but, with Russians, but he worked himself to death and was obviously not in a good environment. But that's the people that are at SpaceX that do this, the people that are at NASA, at these rocket companies, they work very hard, and their lives, it's so hard that their lives, the best ones, their lives center around this. It's built around being able to do this. So the story here is that the only comparable rocket to the Starship, the N1, its main desire, worked himself to death to get it to work. And Elon Musk is a classic work stacker who does many, many things at the same time. I mean, how many companies does Elon Musk have? He owns Twitter. He's involved in that all the time, which personally I think is one of the distracting things, but I get at a level why he's doing it. But this is something to be careful of. Starship is going to fail before it succeeds. Rocket technology is going to fail before it succeeds. So it really is a good reminder that, while there is a lot of people that say, oh, why would they launch and blow up a rocket, and having no idea really ultimately what is involved in making this happen, I am putting good vibes out there to try and hope that Elon Musk stays healthy, that the SpaceX team stays together, that the brilliant minds that are behind this rocket and making this work stay together and work together to do this, because you can see what happens when a rocket of this size, of this magnitude, of this kind of pressure does to a person and the human being. There are human beings that are making this rocket go to space and eventually bring us to Mars. So it's a reminder for me, because as I've learned through doing this podcast, and being an aerospace engineer and just an engineer where you are grinding and putting in hours and hours of work to get this physics of whatever you're doing to work, we all need to look out for ourselves. And after the pandemic and how many of us have changed the entire way of how we deal with our body and keeping ourselves healthy, it's a big reminder that this is a huge, massive goal, and they are going. I would be surprised if a lot of the team has slept more than a few hours at a time. There's so much that's being accumulated and gathered as far as this test. And what I hope is that they stay healthy and keep their minds right, as well as their bodies, and don't suffer the same fate as Sergei Korolev, who arguably was a great mind in rocketry, unfortunately for the Soviets, but worked himself to death. So, to end on a less dark note, thank you for joining us for a little bit of space story time here. Again, we talked about the N1 and the story of the humans behind it, and really what is the same and different between the N1 and Starship. Now, if we talk about the history of the tests, so the 4 tests or launch attempts, the first one, February 21st, 1969, it explodes at 12,200 meters in altitude, 69 seconds after liftoff. July 3rd, 1969, at liftoff, a loose bolt was ingested into a fuel pump, which failed. And then the fuel pump's no longer operable. The automatic engine control shuts off 29 of the 30 engines, and that caused the rockets to stall. Then the rocket explodes 23 seconds after shutting off the engine, and then the rocket and the launch tower get destroyed in the biggest explosion in the history of rocketry. Korolev dies between the next attempt, those 2 years, 1969 and 1971, and on June 24th, vehicle serial number 6L has an uncontrolled roll after liftoff, and the control system can't compensate, and 51 seconds after launch, it blows up at an altitude of 1 kilometers, and the final test flight, November 22nd, 1972, just over a year later, vehicle serial number 7L, the engines run for 107 seconds, and then the first stage engine cuts off at 40 kilometers. The program shut down of some of the engines. They were trying to prevent the stress on the structure. It leads to an explosion on engine number 4, and the vehicle is no more. So, yeah, we definitely had more success on this first flight than it seems that the N1 had in all of its attempts. But they still need to successfully get to orbit, and we need to start testing Starship and its landing and abort capabilities before we even put a single human being on there. But we're very excited to see what SpaceX does. They're the best at what they do, and they're going to have a lot of tries at this. So, SpaceX team, be healthy, take care of yourselves, and we'll get ready for the gauntlet that's coming on the way to the moon and to Mars. So that's it, folks. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Today in Space. As always, spread love and spread science, and we'll see you on the next episode of Today in Space. Be well. See you next time.